to a point where why would I exist in a world where there's no room for me? And to me, it was the darkest time where I started to realize maybe it's also a way for me to express those emotions through creating artwork. Dark artwork, but again, at least it's still artwork. And I brought my journal with me here, so I'm just gonna impromptu. I haven't really read a few of my journals in public before, so just bear with me. So I was looking through my old stuff, and I stumbled upon a journal that I wrote at that age, at the same time that I actually did this drawing. And it's just a little segment, and I said, but the memories is hard to get rid of, like the times when some people in school would call me gay or faggot, but it's really embarrassing when they say it to me in the bus, as other people would stare at me and laugh. I had to get off the bus. But as one guy said, well, goodbye, faggot, just leave. And I did, and I walked the rest of the way home. And sometimes guys would just walk behind me and throw snowballs at me as I walked towards the bus stop. Luckily, they were really poor at aiming at stuff. Or high school students approaching me, asking me whether if I want to buy a gun to shoot myself. These are the kind of experiences that I had to go through. And these are only just a chip of what I had to battle, trying to exist in a world that has code-defying ideas of how people should be or live. So again, going back to the whole idea of narratives and performance and changing yourself, there's this idea of performance to survive. This is a photo of me, by the way, in high school. I have to pretend I'm like a thug, straight kid, so no one would bother me. So there was this idea of performing to survive, to just not be harassed, not be endangered. I was scared for my life. So I realized I had to live as someone else in order to just survive. But that stopped, and I gained the courage to just surrounding myself with friends and trying to figure out and trying to fight it. So, and my name used to be Franklin. So from, I know, Franklin Julius. So from Franklin to Julius. And after high school, I returned back home to the Philippines. That was in 2004. And it's an odd experience because, again, when I grew up most of the time in Toronto and have assimilated myself and learned and acquired how to be or what to be, and I got this word called Diasporic Queer Pygmalion Complex, which I think I was kind of suffering through. So there's this idea where when I returned home, nothing seems familiar. When I returned home, there's an essence of a part of me being estranged from the place where I grew up and I was born. And to me, it was an odd feeling. And I started to realize this idea of not owning any idea of belonging to a land. And I started to realize the land belonging to us, we don't own the land. And maybe it's this idea that belonging somewhere is just an imaginary belonging where it doesn't exist. It's not a tangible space. It's in the mind. And that's what I started to create my work in, to create this idea of sense of belonging, of what has been erased or rechanged or transformed. This one, I just love this photograph of the pineapple fields in the Philippines in 2004, and the neighbors in Manila. And to me, I knew I should feel like I was home, but I felt like I didn't feel home anymore. But at the same time, I don't feel quite at home in Canada, or I don't see myself as truly Canadian. So a lot of my work is really trying to excavate that there is no such thing as us linking towards a sense of belonging. And to me, I had to grasp that idea that maybe this new hybridized space exists only within thoughts and within the artwork itself. So I decided to go to OCAD and study BFA and learn all of the traditional academic classical skills and practices. And I was so hungry to just become a camera, to just reduplicate a figure, an image as realistic as possible, because that's what the classical skills should be or ought to be. I wasn't really paying attention what I was drawing or whom I was drawing or what I was drawing, as long as I was drawing something quite realistic. And here's another one for pencil crayon on blackboard. And there's something that happens that I realized looking back at all of my work is that most of it are men, are white, homonormative men. And some of them are images of my boyfriends that I've dated. So stashed away, I have collections of all ex-boyfriends that I've ever dated, drawing. I haven't gotten the guts to make a show about the ex-boyfriends. So I started to think why I was painting, why I was drawing, and what I was drawing. So I decided to back off on drawing and painting and really look closely at what is affecting me and think about it in a much more conceptual idea of how to create something else. So learning the idea of homonormative standards, growing up as a teenager, all of this ads that shows this ultra masculine, queer, white bodies, or whitewashed bodies, or if it's another culture, it's exoticized. So I started to kind of look closely about that idea of sense of belonging or unbelonging or displacement, and looking back towards my own cultural history. And I was looking a lot about tribal Filipino tattooing. I kind of find it funny how one of the guy there looks like Bruno Mars over there. So I was thinking about the intricate of the identity of crafting, of a body mark making, and that idea of exchange of places within the tribe. And at that point, I got married and I lived in Paris, France for a year. And all the materials that I had was just a bunch of gay magazines. So I started to challenge myself to do a cutout or a drawn image every single day, to the point I had hundreds of them. And I started to think of creating artwork that is compact, that can travel with me when I return. So I started to do a series of cutting out images and really questioning this idea of the male body, of what is held up as perfection. So I started to question it. Why am I killing myself to look like this or to want someone who looks like this? And a lot of those questions arise from excavating drawn lines using negative space and using colonial images as well. And then I started to use this idea of hybridizing those images of colonial aesthetics, European aesthetics, and yet having to execute it within all of these forms. And it kind of reminded me again, that idea of tattooing the body, excavating the negative space to create a notion of hybridized images. And I started to play around on what would happen if it actually started to come out of the wall. So a lot of the pieces starts to kind of resemble this very Gothic, Eurocentric, religious iconographies. And it reminded me of the sacred and the profane, and how we put things in a pedestal. And I was talking about it in a way of queer belongings or queer migrant belongings, and how we became invisible or exoticized within mainstream. And as you notice, I'm slowly kind of going through the ideas of religion here. And I'm always trying to think back through my childhood experiences. And I remember I hate going to Sunday Mass as a child in the Philippines, because I had no concept why we have to go to this church. It's beautiful, but there's a dead man that's bleeding on a piece of wood. And to me, it was, as a child, I didn't know the concept. I was like, people sit here and they stare at the dead corpse, and I was just in fear. And it didn't help, there was like bats flying around. And so I was just questioning myself, why are we doing this? Is this kind of ritual that seems strange to me as a child, and questioning it. And then later on, realizing the idea of people's belief system. I do have respect for people's belief system, but for my belief system, I would probably feel closer to any kind of form of higher power, being closer to nature, rather than trapped inside a colonial chapel or church. So I started to create this work that was projected in One Spadina Crescent at U of T, and it's a life-size crucifix. And I was really playing around this ideology of the hybridized religion and gods. And if you look closely, there's actually little intricate symbols of this idea of capitalism, of idea of what do people sometimes feel like they uphold, right? This materiality of things. There's a Mac symbol there, there's Louis Vuitton, McDonald's, Chanel. So I started to play along this idea and started to construct the flesh like a sculpture with fairies bursting out of the crucifix. And here's a detail of it. And none of my work do last, and I don't do work specifically for the idea of preservation. I allow my work to kind of just self-destruct afterwards, because I think that there's something great about that idea of a work that is inhabiting a time and space that will inevitably disappear. But we're talking about how to archive it. It's archived. People from photographs, from Instagram, from recordings. So to me, that was fascinating. And it was fascinating to know if I'm dealing with something that talks about loss and erasure, I better create work that I allow to be erased or not last for a long time and let it decay. There was this I want to talk about this idea of land reclaiming itself in the Philippines. So when the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, they built this chapel near the Mayon volcano. And what happened was the volcano erupted and basically claimed and covered up the church to the point where all you see is the actual tower itself. And to me, this symbolized an idea of how no matter how much colonization tried to take over a country, a land, and claiming it to be theirs, somehow, sometimes the land will try and reclaim its own self. And I love this idea and this story. So I started crafting altars about it and using books and this academic books and really questioning what's inside this text in these books and creating a shrine for it. And what I've done is I started to excavate the texts where in some of the texts, I would just leave gay narrative innuendos, even though it's like a book about research on some philosophical idea. I started to rewrite things, and I saw the power of picking and choosing and recrafting, recreating and changing and transforming the materials that I was using. So I started to think about negative space as body in the Shooting Blank series, where I would cut out the figures that I really questioned and really talking about the absence of the figure and me looking at the figure, looking at what I need to be looking at to be transformed into. So I started to really excavate this ideal notion of what if I took out the figure completely, the figures that has been represented into this realm of queer identity where everything, this is the homonormative queer bodies. These are the ideas that is circulated still. And if it's another culture, it would be exoticized. So I still find it hard to kind of like this notion of fitting in and completely rearranging myself. And I feel like I have to constantly rearrange myself and change myself as years goes by, where I completely would turn into a different person. And all of these images that bombards us, which kind of made me interested into the next slide. This is the homonormative templates. And on the picture on the left is Pride in UK in 2010. And the picture on the right is actually Marco, an underwear company, and a fashion show in New York in 2018. The interesting part about the picture on the right is the models that they used were trans. And looking at the image of this appropriation of masculinity and homonormativity, I was kind of shocked how within also trans community, they surrender to this template of this perfection of the body, of the homonormative standards. So this really, and I just stumbled upon this image just recently. So it really kind of questions me that homonormative idea is still predominant and it's still there. And it's kind of, if you're outside of that representation, you better work your ass off and become that person. And that's what I feel like the world is telling me. So it's that constant struggle to the point that I just need to eliminate the representation of the body, just remove it completely. And then I just went nuts. I just started every single time I see a male figure, I would just cut it out. I would cut it out, I would dispose of it, and I would just displace this series of blank figures, which then excavated to an idea about the Shooting Blank series, where I went back to my history books and chose classical paintings of the male figures and recontextualizing them and placing them in very contemporary settings, in a way kind of queering up history. So in the next slide, we were talking about the homonormative, the media and culture. So growing up, I'm watching all of this TV show like Queer as Folk, Dante's Cove, Mambo Italiano, Will and Grace, and I wasn't seeing myself. I wasn't seeing an Asian gay character growing up. And it was difficult. It was difficult to belong because these are the visions of ideal acceptance within queer confines. And I was a bit pissed off and lost, so I signed up for background performing and I inserted myself